biochemistry, and I have for the last 25 years devoted that science, my mastery of that science, to the field of nutrition, and specifically the application of food supplements to promoting health. So
Dr. Stan, basically you've had the background in the 15, you said 15 years or
25. And that sort of gives away my age, unfortunately, but
still very young.
It's even more than that. It's where the picture is worse than that.
Well, I listened to the tape, and it was very well done, and it was interesting. I listened to it several times, and from what I understood, it had a different approach to the immune system, and I guess you'd say rebuilding or helping the immune system to become stronger. And it's very novel. Now, the premise was at the beginning is that we have these common plagues, and perhaps could you go into some of the research you mentioned prior to that, and some of the mainstream articles, that these plagues are prevalent and we need to be aware of?
I'd like to actually give you a little bit of brief personal history about how I became interested in this. I work for a company which is Infinity, which is a health company. I'm the person who's in charge of research and development for them. Have been for about 2 years. Prior to that, I was for 8 years an executive with a company called National Enzyme Company. And the application of enzymes to nutrition was my main focus. And so I became very tuned in to the physiology and the biochemistry, especially of the digestive system. And in doing research, part of the job of research is to find out what already exists in the medical literature and in the health literature. And I began to run across what I found to be some very disturbing trends. And I'd like to enumerate those for you. First of all, I found a trend which kind of shocked me. It jarred me a little bit because I, like so many people who are involved in health sciences, have been under the impression that the main diseases that I should say the only diseases we needed to be concerned about were what we call the degenerative diseases, things like heart disease and diabetes and cancer, and certainly I'm not here to say that we should be any less concerned about those. But what we've tended to do in our thinking really over the last 30 or 40 years is to minimize the danger of infectious diseases. So much so, in fact, that in 1969, a rather famous remark was made by a famous person, our Surgeon General, Dr. Stewart, made the statement that it's time to close the book on infectious disease. And really what he was doing was he was just simply espousing what was then, and for the most part is still, the prevalent thinking in the health world and the medical community.
We've conquered
infectious
disease.
We have gained the power now, and that the microbes no longer are a threat to us. And you know, of course, that arose from the belief or the understanding. Really, it's the truth that we have come a long way in understanding microbial life and our interaction with it, and we have indeed made a lot of strides in sanitation and in good health measures of being able to quarantine people and so on like that. But most of all, what has more than anything else given the medical community the sense of power that they no longer need dread infectious disease is the development in 1928 of the very first antibiotic.
Right.
Dr. Alexander Fleming, a brilliant medical researcher in the United Kingdom, developed penicillin and announced it to the world. And from that moment on, you can almost, if you are into medical sociology, you can almost from that point on trace a different thought pattern in the medical mind steadily growing. They say that you can trace the disappearance of the house call as an exact inverse occurrence along with the development of antibiotics.
And that was the prevalence, basically, of what we call the pharmaceutical industry then, because now you see such a large lobbying force for, like we said, antibiotics, which is just one arsenal of drugs that are available.
Absolutely. You know, One of the books really that I read, that I ran across in my literature searches, and I read a lot of peer review articles, but I did run across a reference to this book, and the title that was cited jarred me, and I had to go get the book and read it. And it was written published in 1992, written by an eminent professor of medicine at Tufts University, one of the really premier medical universities. And it's the title of the book is The Antibiotic Paradox. Subtitle, How Miracle Drugs Have Destroyed the Miracle. And, you know, I can remember the days. Pretty good. I'm old enough that I can recall the days that when we used the term miracle drugs, and to a great extent what we were talking about was antibiotics. Right. Because in the post-World War II era, for the first time you could, some of these deadly infections that up to that time people would be expected to die from, like pneumonia or some other serious infection, they could go to the hospital and get an antibiotic injection and be released the next day or something. And so they were miracles. They were like miracles. And so they called them miracle drugs, sure enough. And that was a very appropriate title. But what Dr. Stuart Levy, the author of this book, pointed out was that those miracle drugs have actually created their own demise, so to speak. In other words, they have created the conditions where they are no longer miracles. They have destroyed their own miracle that they created. And the way that happens is real simple. I don't want to run over your words or anything. Oh, sure, go ahead. But just to continue the thought, the way that happens is real simple, as Dr. Levy describes it in his book. When you give a person, or suppose you're a doctor, and you give a person an antibiotic, then the bacteria that die from the administration of that antibiotic are the ones that are weak. Sure. And so the ones that don't die are, guess what, antibiotic resistant. And then they have babies, you know. And when bacteria have babies, they double their population every 20 minutes. Wow. So now, after the administration of antibiotic, you are automatically, to some degree, maybe it's very minute, but maybe you are to some degree a carrier of now what are antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Now, the worst abuse of that principle has come in when doctors casually use antibiotics, or they use antibiotics which, you know, just on the suspicion that you might have an infection. Along with that, just if I interject, I read in the LA Times a recent article, which is on the news, that 21%, according to the study, of antibiotics that were prescribed were basically useless. I remember that it came on the morning news and so forth. So we're talking about 1/5 of the profits for pharmaceuticals were basically prescribed and had no need because it was either for viral or non-existent. You know, it was no use. And so that just goes along with what you're saying. That study you mentioned is I've heard of that one, and it's actually a very conservative study. Right. There are other studies that I've read that show that as high, in certain areas, in certain situations, as high as 2/3 of the prescriptions for antibiotics are either for the wrong antibiotic or they're for an antibiotic given where there is no bacterial infection. Now, you got to remember, antibiotics only are useful against bacteria. They have no effect against viruses. They have no effect against parasites. They have no effect against a fungal infection. Right. And, you know, it's too often the case. Right. And it has become too often the case, I should say, in just everyday medical practice, that the doctors have taken such a, and I don't mean to bash doctors when I say this, but it's a fact. Right. It's just a fact. That many doctors have taken such a feeling of power into their hands by the virtue of the fact that they have the antibiotics that they just prescribe them as sort of an expression of their doctorship or whatever. And or sometimes they, and this is real often the case, and very intelligent doctors do this sometimes they'll prescribe an antibiotic just to see if the patient responds to it.
You know, a good point you brought up was that I almost don't blame the doctors as much because of some circumstances I had at school where I've had teachers say when the doctor did not prescribe because they knew for certain ear infections, for example, and viral pneumonia or something, or bronchial whatever infection, it was useless. And they told them, they said, well, these are other steps, alternative you should take. So they were wise. And these people wanted to switch doctors because they didn't get the magic pill. They were upset about it. And then on top of it, another friend said, another friend of my wife's who is a doctor was getting pressure because he wasn't prescribing enough from some companies. And I thought, you know, so they also have certain pressures from society which we need to take responsibility and say for ourselves, a doctor, well, is this really necessary? You know.
Actually, I'd like to get into that as I develop the idea a little more as we discuss this. And I actually have read some of the recommendations of some of the academies of practice, and many of the best, like for example the American Academy of Family Practice has developed a set of guidelines for prescribing antibiotics that are fairly restrictive. And if those are followed, it would curb a lot of the abuse.
Right.
But I honestly think that a lot of the solution to the kind of problem that's happening it lies with, as you say, with personal responsibility being taken both by the doctor and by the patient.
Right.
And but I want to get into that just a little bit later in our discussion, if I could. So because I want to develop a couple ideas a little more.
Great.
I would like to point out that there has been a great deal of notice taken of the fact that, as Dr. Levy points out in his book, and many other writers as well. Now, since that time, since I read Dr. Levy's book, I've uncovered about a dozen excellent other books on this subject, as well as numerous peer review and popular magazine articles, including some feature articles in the best read news magazines. Newsweek magazine, for example, had a big article back in 1994. And it was a cover article, where they featured it on the cover of the magazine, and it was about the development of, about how antibiotics are ceasing to work. The old familiar antibiotics, more and more bacteria of that strain that used to respond to that antibiotic no longer respond, and they have to use stronger antibiotics. And the real bad news is that more and more of the bacteria are becoming immune totally to antibiotics, even the strongest ones. Yeah, that's right. And and one of the places that this is happening, by the way, is in hospitals. The so-called nosocomial infections, the hospital-borne infections.
Now that's a good one I wanted to go over because the tape had mentioned that. I think the public needs to understand what those words mean. There's two words, nosocomial, and then I also read from Dr. Mendelsohn, iatrogenic.
Oh, yes.
And both those words are something that if someone sees that on their diagnosis wouldn't understand, but when they get explained, they may have a totally different understanding as to what's really going on. So if you want to elaborate, that would be it.
Well, I recently gave the talk that the tape that you heard is based on. I gave it in a small town in eastern Arizona, and I gave the example that, well, you might go into a hospital and to have an ingrown toenail removed, and you get a hospital-borne infection, and you have to have the toe cut off. The funny thing was that a man in the audience raised his hand and said that exact same thing happened. That thing happened to him, and he showed his toe that had been amputated because exactly that happened. And of course, hopefully that doesn't happen real often, but it is happening often enough. The occurrence of nosocomial, meaning hospital-borne infection. You went in for something entirely different, some routine thing, and there is a bug lurking in that hospital, a bacteria that isn't responding to antibiotics, and you were exposed to it, and you get the infection of it, and you have a disease you didn't expect.
And iatrogenic isn't that doctor
Iatrogenic means that the treatment caused the disease.
Right.
Any treatment that causes a disease is called an iatrogenic disease. Yeah. So, yeah, those are two important words that people need to know. They need to know those words. But here's what the point that has really struck me, and that is that with the development, partly because of the development of antibiotic-resistant strains of bacteria, partly because of the development of new kinds of infections, things that we didn't know existed,
right,
that, you know, are partly the result of mutation. They're partly the result of us ecologically exposing new areas of the world, penetrating into the rainforests and into the jungles and so forth, and being exposed for the first time, mankind being exposed to agents of infection that we haven't, and possibly even, you know, other things lurking on the horizon, like frankly, there's a phenomenon that I'm watching very closely right now in the literature that's going on mainly in the coastal areas of the U.S. and particularly on the East Coast, which is the development of the algae blooms, the big fish kills that are going on, where large areas, marine life populations are being wiped out, but even humans in those areas are becoming seriously ill. We don't see reports of deaths,
right,
fortunately, as a result of any of that. But I'm very concerned about that too, because there may be even agents of infection that we haven't even thought about yet.
And the other one I wanted to bring up and see if you'd heard of, but I'm also concerned about some of the, I guess you'd say, experimentation where they're doing genetic manipulation and the contamination of vaccination because of the hosts that they've got. I've read a Dr. Horowitz book on contaminated monkey viruses, where we had simian virus 40 from the monkey that was taken, and then polio, and then we've also had other ones which most people would never have any idea. So now they've already compromised their immune system.
Dr. Horowitz is, I know Dr. Horowitz pretty well, and admire him a lot. His research is brilliant.
Right.
And of course, his thesis for his book, and I do highly recommend that book, is that there are agents of infection that actually man has created.
Right.
And particularly in the viral area, especially virus. Because, you know, we've been monkeying with genetic engineering for a while now, and not always with the proper precaution, and not always with the full, you know, grasp of what the consequences are.
Like the movie Outbreak, basically, or something similar. Yeah,
and you know, that seems like almost like a science fiction scenario, but it's not as
really
remote as people might think. But the combination of all these factors, all these strange infections, like we're talking about at this stage of our discussion, and the development of the antibiotic-resistant strains, the so-called supergerms, and the re-emergence. Here's the main, one of the really scary things is a re-emergence of old diseases that we thought we had conquered a long time ago, like tuberculosis. We're seeing tuberculosis outbreaks now. You almost can't find a prison system that doesn't have a tuberculosis problem.
Exactly, that's true.
And because that's the ideal conditions for TB to be spread. You know, with all the economic conditions and the close confinement and all sanitation, all the combination of factors. But it isn't just in prisons. It isn't just in prisons, and it isn't just among the poor. TB, by the way, is the all-time killer of mankind. TB has historically killed 1 billion human beings, a little over that. So, but here's kind of the big picture. We're facing a threat of infectious disease, perhaps such as mankind has never faced, and at the same time we're acting as if we've conquered it.
Right.
You know,
it's a paradox.
It is quite a paradox. Here and there we see sort of outcroppings of little reports and streams of thought, like Dr. Horowitz's book, his excellent book, that actually are saying, well, yeah, maybe we shouldn't be so complacent about infectious disease. And I'm adding my little fuel to that fire too. And it's kind of like one of my favorite magazine articles on this subject was it was in U.S. News and World Report. And what I really liked about that article, that was in 1995. And what I really liked about that article was that they actually went to the Centers for Disease Control and they interviewed a lot of the experts that are the heads of the groups that are on the forefront, you know, of the battle against infectious disease. And one of the real choice interviews that was conducted was with a Dr. Mitchell Cohen, who is the head of fungal and infectious diseases branch. And Dr. Cohen, I've heard him say this in some other venues as well, but he made he put it in a nutshell, and he says, we're going back to a pre-antibiotic era. In other words, he's serving notice on the medical world that we're going to have to learn to do without antibiotics.
Right.
And so what that means is that before antibiotics, what we had human natural immunity.
Sure, yeah.
And so what Dr. Cohen is saying, and couldn't have said it better, is, folks, we're going to have to learn how to maximize our own immunity. That's where the answer lies. That's where the preservation of our life lies. So, knowing that, yeah. I've really pondered what constitutes immunity.
Now, that's what in the tape, it brought up a couple areas which are very interesting. Number one was the idea of stomach acid and the mouth being a vector, because we're told to breathe through our nose because it's more of a filter than the mouth is, but people often do breathe through their mouth. Mm-hmm. Therefore, it's a perfect vector for infectious disease. Now, your tape, if you want to elaborate on what is the importance of HCl, hydrochloric acid, and how is it being misused or misguided because of people's so-called heartburn or indigestion, where they want to basically take care of one symptom but create a larger problem in the long run.
You know, most people don't even think of that. Even people in the medical profession
right.
don't think so much of that part of the body being part of the immune defenses.
I did.
But it really is our very first.
Uh-huh.
You know, we don't get too many infections as a result of them landing on our skin. You know, usually our skin wards it off very effectively, unless the skin's broken, which is, you know, we get concerned about being cut, and properly so.
Correct.
But our point of vulnerability is, in fact, our mouth, because we swallow whatever goes in our mouth. You know, it mixes with our saliva and goes down our throat, and so and our whole digestive system is intended to absorb things.
Right.
And so most of the infections we get, in fact, we get as a result of swallowing the agent of infection.
Makes sense, yeah.
And so we're equipped, you know, by you know, the way we're made, we're equipped with a very good protection. And that is exactly what you referred to, the hydrochloric acid bath that bathes everything that comes into our stomach, if it's there. Mm-hmm. The funny thing is, and this is a real paradox, we have somehow gotten the twisted idea that hydrochloric acid is bad.
Yeah, stomach ulcers.
It causes ulcers and it
right.
causes indigestion. Well, let me tell you something. That actually goes back to a mistaken idea by a certain doctor way back in the 1940s, who believed he was curing ulcers by giving his patients chalk powder mixed in with milk. He called it the milk alkali cure, and it never worked. It made the patient feel better
right.
while they were doing it. Classic case of addressing the symptoms instead of the cause.
Right. Placebo. I mean, he neutralizes all he's doing.
That's right. He neutralized some of the stomach acid. The acid never caused the problem, but the acid was there to give you a signal that there was something wrong.
Right.
It's exactly comparable to if the oil warning light goes on in your car, then what you do about that is you snip the wire to the oil light, or you cover it up with a piece of tape or something. I mean, that's right. exactly
right.
the same thing.
Exactly.
And ever since that doctor did that, totally misguided, there has been a whole industry in creating antacids. Mm-hmm. And about in the late 70s, the pharmaceutical industry decided that it was time to create new ways to do that. And so they came up with what are called the acid blockers. And I'll just kind of shortcut my usual story about that in the interest of time, but we have now on the market 4 drugs that are the product of that thinking. And they're Tagamet, Axid, Zantac, and Pepsid.
Right.
Great selling drugs. They say, they boast in their literature that there are 1/2 of the American population on any given day is taking one of those drugs.
Oh.
Now,
that's a huge industry.
It's amazing. It's amazing how successful their promotion of that idea has, in spite of the fact that even the National Institutes of Health came out with an official position paper in 1993 stating that ulcers are not not caused by acid, and they're not cured by antacids. Ulcers, in fact, are caused by a bacteria.
Right.
And it's called Helicobacter pylori, which you don't have to remember the name of that bacteria, right, but it's a bacterial condition. And but in spite of that, you still have these antacids, especially those big four that I mentioned,
right,
being taken by people and even prescribed by doctors to cure, quote unquote, ulcer conditions and even common indigestion. And what people are really doing is they're removing their best first defense against invading organisms.
Because they've neutralized the acid or shut it off,
Exactly
and now
right.
they're not going to be able to have that to kill.
I want to say one more thing about that acid barrier. That's something that every freshman biology student learns in college, the importance of that acid barrier, and then they forget it later, I think.
That's typical. The most important thing, and then later on they've completely forgot about what's so important about that acid. I mean, there's a lot of other areas of the human body which I'm also concerned with that people feel are unimportant, but I'm really questioning about too at this time. We're running right towards the end here, and I want to continue in the second part, going more into this and some other areas of how we can improve our own immunity, because I think everyone is really interested in what's the solution to our problem today. So I wanted to thank you, Stan, for coming on the first show. And we're going to be coming to part 2 in a moment. This is Imagine, Improving Your Immune Defenses. In this day and age, with all the type of bacteria, viruses, fungi, or microbes that can cause disease, and the fact that even the Centers of Disease Control admits the fact that perhaps we may not have defenses against them through antibiotics and so forth, it is important, and I think you'll find it important to learn what can you do to improve your own immune systems. So please stay tuned, and we'll see in the next part to learn more strategies and ideas that can help you with your immune system. Thank you. This has been Imagine.